There was a moment in British history when the whole world looked at our schools and asked how we did it. Real envy written into education journals from Paris to Tokyo. And then in less than 50 years we rebuilt the entire system so many times that almost nobody alive today can tell you which version they actually grew up inside. Nobody rang a bell when it changed. It just happened, quietly, in committee rooms and government circulars, while ordinary families were told each time that it was for their own good. Let me take you back to 1944. Britain was still bleeding from the war. Rationing hadn't ended. Cities were still full of bomb craters. And in the middle of all that wreckage, Parliament passed something extraordinary, the Butler Education Act. For the first time in British history, secondary education became free for every child, rich or poor. Before that act, where you went to school and how far you went depended almost entirely on what your father earned. After it, in theory, it depended on what was in your head. Hold on to that word, theory. It matters more than you'd think. The Butler Act created what became known as the tripartite system, 3 types of school, sorted by a single exam sat at the age of 11, pass, and you went to a grammar school, Latin, sciences, university preparation, a path toward the professions, fail. And for the vast majority of children that meant a secondary modern school built for a life of manual and clerical work, with almost no route back to anything academic. A small number went to technical schools, though so few were ever built that they barely mattered. Picture it. You're 11 years old, sitting in a hall with your classmates, no coaching in most working-class homes, and one single morning of exam questions decides which of 2 entirely different lives you're going to live. Pass, and doors open. Fail, and for most children they close for good. The grammar schools that came out of this system were genuinely excellent. Rigorous academics, Latin and Greek, proper science laboratories, teachers who expected you to reach for something higher. For the children who got in, it really could change everything. But here's what almost nobody talks about, and it's the detail that starts pulling this whole story apart. 2/3 of every grammar school place went to children from middle-class homes. Passing the 11+ depended on things money could quietly buy. A quiet house to study in. Parents with the time and confidence to help. The exam looked neutral. It wasn't. It was the documented reality of the era. And it wasn't because working-class children were less capable. There was another layer to it too. Girls in many areas had to score higher than boys to win the same number of grammar school places, because education authorities capped the number of girls admitted. A bright girl and an average boy could sit the same test, get similar marks, and only the boy would walk through the grammar school gates. Nobody was told to be outraged. Families simply absorbed which category they belonged to. And think about the other side of that divide, the secondary modern schools, where roughly 3/4 of children ended up. Parents at the time had a blunt name for them, dump schools. That's a direct reflection of how they were regarded, not by strangers but by the very communities whose children filled them. These schools were underfunded compared to the grammars, staff were paid less, buildings were often older and shabbier, almost nobody who lived through it actually believed they were equal. So by the 1950s, cracks were showing everywhere. Working-class families watched their children leave school early, funneled toward jobs their parents already had. Middle-class families quietly protected their advantage through the very same test that was supposed to erase it. And a growing number of politicians, educators and parents started asking the same uncomfortable question. If this system was meant to reward ability, why did it look so much like it was simply rewarding money? That question didn't stay quiet for long. Before I tell you what happened next, if you're finding this as fascinating as I am, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because we cover the real, deeply researched history of British life like this every week, and this story only gets more dramatic from here. On the 12th of July 1965, a document landed on the desks of every local education authority in England and Wales. It was called Circular 1065, and the man behind it was Anthony Crosland, Labour's newly appointed Secretary of State for Education. Crosland believed the tripartite system was fundamentally broken, sorting children by class dressed up as ability. His solution, Ask every council in the country to submit a plan for moving toward comprehensive schools, places where children of every ability level would learn side by side. No 11+, no dividing line. Here's the detail almost nobody remembers. The circular carried no legal force. On paper, it looked gentle, almost optional. In practice, the pressure behind it was anything but soft. The following year, a second circular made the real stakes clear. Government funding for new schools would now only go to councils that had committed to comprehensive reorganization. Refusing to change was expensive. The numbers tell you everything about how fast this moved. In 15 years, the entire architecture of British secondary education had been rebuilt, school by school, county by county. Not everyone accepted this quietly. The grammar school lobby fought back hard. Some counties simply refused to comply, or dragged their feet for years, holding on to selective schools while neighboring areas transformed entirely. And when the political wind changed in 1970, it was Margaret Thatcher, then Secretary of State for Education under Edward Heath's government, who issued Circular 1070, formally withdrawing Crosland's request and handing the decision back to local councils. It's a strange footnote of history that the same politician later remembered as the fiercest defender of academic selection actually approved more school closures and comprehensive conversions during her own time at the Department of Education than any other education secretary before or since, because by then the machinery Crosland built was already running. Here's something that got quietly buried inside all this reform, and it explains a lot about why standards later became such a battleground. In the mid-1960s, alongside the push toward comprehensives, Britain introduced a second qualification called the Certificate of Secondary Education, the CSE. The O-level, the traditional academic exam, had only ever been designed for the top 20% of pupils by ability. That left the vast majority of teenagers leaving school with nothing formal to show for their education. The CSE was meant to fill that gap, covering roughly the next 40%. But look closely at how these two exams worked, and the old class divide hadn't disappeared, it had simply been renamed. All levels stayed under the control of serious examination boards with direct links to universities. CSEs were run regionally, and in a system called Mode 3, individual schools could even design and mark their own assessments. Employers noticed the difference immediately. A CSE Grade 1 was technically supposed to equal an O-level pass, but in the world of hiring managers, it rarely carried the same weight. By the mid-1970s, exam boards began collaborating on joint 16+ papers, letting the same students walk away with both a CSE grade and an equivalent O-level grade from a single sitting. It was an admission that keeping two separate systems no longer made sense. That pressure built for over a decade before anyone acted on it. It wasn't until 1988, more than 2 decades after Crosland's original circular, that the two exams were finally merged into a single qualification for every 16-year-old in the country, the GCSE. On paper, it looked like the end of an unfair divide. In reality, critics on both sides of the political spectrum were already asking a much harder question. When you merge a rigorous academic exam with a less standardized one, which direction does the average grade move? Up, to match the higher standard? Or down, to avoid comprehensive schools producing results that looked embarrassing next to what grammar schools used to achieve? That question is still argued about today. Long. But in the 1970s and 80s, it wasn't abstract. It was playing out in real classrooms, with real families watching a system they no longer fully recognized. Remember the grammar schools I mentioned earlier, the ones with the best academic results in the entire country? There was a special category among them called direct grant grammar schools, partly funded by the state, partly by fees, but crucially, required by law to keep at least a quarter of their places completely free, reserved for able children nominated from ordinary state primary schools, selected purely on merit. Manchester Grammar School was among the most famous. These weren't finishing schools for the wealthy. They were, in the words of one member of parliament at the time, the most socially integrated schools in the entire country. The results were extraordinary. 32% of direct grant school pupils went on to university places. Compare that to 20% from fully independent schools, 19% from ordinary maintained grammar schools, and just 4% from everywhere else. These were, by every measurable standard, among the most effective schools Britain had ever produced, taking children from ordinary working families and sending them into higher education at rates the elite private sector couldn't match. In 1975, the government ended the direct grant scheme entirely. Every one of these roughly 170 schools was told to choose. Become a fully state-run comprehensive, giving up selection completely, or become a fully independent, fee-paying school. It wasn't reform, it was an ultimatum. Of the roughly 170 schools, only about 50, most of them Catholic schools with strong community ties, chose to join the state comprehensive system and stay free for everyone. The rest chose independence. They kept their academic standards, their reputations, their results. What they gave up was the legal requirement to educate a quarter of their pupils for free. Manchester Grammar School is fee-paying to this day. So are dozens of others that once stood as genuine bridges. The bridge didn't collapse, it was tolled, and the families who couldn't afford the toll were quietly redirected to the new comprehensive down the road, whatever quality that happened to be. Look at what the national statistics show in the years that followed, and the pattern becomes unmistakable. Between 1963 and 1978, the proportion of pupils attending fully independent schools in Britain actually fell, from around 8% down to under 6%, as grammar schools converted into comprehensives and absorbed most of their former pupils into the free state system. For a moment it genuinely looked like the reformers had succeeded. Then came the 1980s, and the trend reversed completely. The proportion of children in independent schools began climbing again, even as the total number of school-aged children in the country was falling. Parents who could afford to opt out of the new comprehensive system were doing exactly that, in growing numbers, year after year. By the late 1980s, Margaret Thatcher's government introduced a different kind of reform entirely, one built around the free market. The Education Reform Act of 1988 was the biggest shake-up of British schooling since the Butler Act itself. Every state school was required to teach the same national curriculum, and alongside it came the newly merged GCSE. And then came league tables. Every school's exam results published, ranked, compared, available to any parent willing to look. The theory was straightforward. Give parents the information to choose the best school, and competition would lift the whole system. It sounded fair. Every school, same curriculum, same exams, judged by the same yardstick. But researchers who studied the impact of this system gave it an unflinching name: selection by mortgage. Long? If the best performing comprehensive published the best results, house prices in that school's catchment area climbed accordingly. Families with money bought their way into the right postcode. The 11 plus had been abolished specifically to stop wealth from determining education. Now wealth determined it again, through an estate agent's listing instead of a written test. Sociologists studying these market reforms coined another phrase for what happened inside individual schools: educational triage. Under pressure to climb the league tables, some schools began quietly concentrating attention on pupils sitting right on the borderline between a passing grade and a failing one. The students whose improvement would most visibly boost the school's published statistics. Pupils already excelling needed less input to keep passing. Pupils judged unlikely to pass at all, however unfairly, sometimes received the least support of anyone in the room. None of this means the reformers of 1988 acted in bad faith. Many genuinely believed transparency and competition would lift standards, and in some measurable ways they did. But the deeper problem, running underneath every single reform since 1944, never actually went away: saw children at 11, and money buys tutoring for the exam. Abolish the exam, and money buys the postcode. Publish the results to expose bad schools, and money buys the house next to the good one. Alongside all this structural change came a genuine shift in teaching philosophy too. Many comprehensive schools embraced what was called discovery learning, lessons built around exploration, with far less direct instruction from the front of the room. Some universities quietly dropped requirements like O-level Latin for entry, partly because comprehensives increasingly didn't offer it, a subject that had been standard at most grammar schools for generations. The public reaction wasn't gentle. Newspapers ran sensational stories warning standards were collapsing. When the television drama Grange Hill first aired in 1978, its unvarnished portrayal of comprehensive school life became a genuine talking point, and to a nervous public, it read less like fiction and more like confirmation of their worst fears. A country that once measured its schools by the rigor of Latin declensions and a single exam had within 25 years rebuilt its entire understanding of what a good education even meant. Nobody had ever put that redefinition to a public vote. If you're finding this as gripping as I am, take a second now to hit subscribe, because what the research actually found next might surprise you more than anything so far. Now here's where I have to be honest with you, because good history tells you what the evidence actually shows, not just what you want to hear, and on this point the evidence is genuinely surprising. For decades the popular story has been simple. Grammar schools were engines of opportunity. Comprehensives killed that opportunity, and Britain has been paying the price in stalled social mobility ever since. It's a clean story. Multiple large-scale academic studies, tracking real people across real decades, have found it isn't quite true. Researchers comparing areas of England that kept their grammar schools against areas that fully converted to comprehensives in the 1960s and 70s found something that surprised almost everyone involved. Overall social mobility in Britain did rise during this period, but when researchers traced that rise back to its source, they found no meaningful link to which type of school system a particular region used. Why? Because the grammar school system was never just helping working-class children. It was simultaneously holding another set of working-class children back. For every child who benefited from a grammar school place, there was another child, often from a very similar background, sitting in a secondary modern next door, receiving fewer resources and lower expectations. Modern research looking at the full picture found the benefits and the harms essentially cancelled each other out nationally. Even today's surviving grammar schools tell the same story. Fewer than 3% of grammar school pupils are eligible for free school meals, compared to over 13% across state schools generally. Long before any child sits the modern 11+, most of the attainment gap between richer and poorer children has already opened up, shaped by years of home environment and primary school quality. The exams simply can't see past. So if you're waiting for me to tell you exactly who to blame, I have to disappoint you slightly. There isn't one villain here. There's a country that spent 80 years trying to build a fair sorting system, and discovered, reform after reform, that fairness was never really about the sorting mechanism at all. The story didn't stop in the 1980s either. In 2010, under Education Secretary Michael Gove, schools were encouraged, and often effectively required, to become academies, state-funded but independent of local council control. In 2010, roughly 6% of state secondary schools held academy status. Within a decade, that figure passed 60%. Alongside academies came free schools, entirely new institutions set up by parents, teachers, or charitable groups, bypassing local authorities altogether. Supporters called it the fastest rate of education reform in English history. Critics called it something else. A patchwork of unaccountable provision. Schools now answerable to a trust or sponsor rather than an elected local council. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same argument, in new clothing, repeated at every turning point in this story since 1944. Centralize control, and you risk uniformity without accountability. Decentralize it, and you risk a postcode lottery. 80 years. 5 major reorganizations. The 11+, comprehensivization, the direct grant abolition, the market reforms of the Thatcher years, the Academy's revolution. Each one promised to finally solve the problem the last one created. Each one, in its own way, did solve something, and each one left a new gap for advantage to slip through. If you grew up inside any one of these systems, you probably remember it as simply the way things were. You didn't know it was the fourth or fifth version of an argument that started before you were even born. It just feels like school. So what was actually lost if it wasn't simply social mobility in the way we usually assume? I think it was certainty. In 1944, a family could send their child to school knowing exactly what the system promised. It was brutally unfair to plenty of children, and I'm not asking you to romanticize that unfairness. But it was legible. Everyone understood the rules, even the ones who resented them. What replaced it was something far less legible. A patchwork where a child's opportunity now depends on the average house price nearby, on whether the local comprehensive happened to be well run that decade, on which exam board the school chose. No single villain designed this patchwork. It emerged, piece by piece, out of dozens of well-intentioned decisions, each one trying to fix the unfairness the last one had accidentally created. I want to end this the way I think this story actually deserves, not with a villain, and not with a simple lesson, because neither one would be honest. If you sat the 11 plus, whichever way it went for you, that exam probably shaped more of your life than almost anything else that happened to you as a child. If you passed, you likely remember exactly how it felt walking into a grammar school for the first time, and you probably also remember the friend who didn't get in, and how differently your lives went from that single morning onward. If you didn't pass, you know a different memory. The one where a piece of paper at age 11 quietly told you what kind of future you were allowed to want, whether or not it was ever true, long. And if you were a parent watching your own children go through the comprehensive system that came after, or the academy system after that, you know the other side of this story too, the uncertainty. The uncertainty of not quite knowing whether the school down the road was really as good as its reputation, or whether you should have stretched your finances to move somewhere the results looked better on paper. None of these experiences are wrong. They're all real pieces of the same 80-year argument Britain has been having with itself about what a fair education actually looks like. And if this video taught you anything today, I hope it's this. The people who built each version of this system, from Rab Butler in 1944 to Michael Gove more recently, none of them set out to make things worse. They were all trying to fix something. The tragedy, if there is one, isn't malice. It's how consistently good intentions, applied to a problem this old, keep finding new ways to fall short of solving it. If this brought back memories, good or difficult, I'd genuinely like to hear them. Tell me in the comments whether you passed or failed the 11 plus, or what you remember about the school your own children went through. And if you found this as fascinating as I did putting it together, hit like, subscribe for more of this real, deeply researched British history, and share it with someone who lived through part of this story themselves. They'll have opinions, they always do,